it started out kind of small in the early 70s as a local evangelistic thing, but even that was amazing that they could even do that under the communists. But I do know for sure that Billy Graham was at this church some years later, and the communists would not let him do an altar call, which was part of his ministry, but they let these guys do it during this time, which is crazy. But so she saw these simple messages in the Bible. She saw blind people seeing. She saw lame people walking. She saw the same things that she was seeing there in that church. It wasn't until sometime later that somebody told her that's not what normally happens in most churches. She just thought that was the way it was supposed to be because that's all she had seen. That's what she read. Must be.
We can change the world. Let's go. We can do it. Matter of fact, we will. Yes, this world bleeding in my God can heal. Yes, every time when I'm out in the field, the heartbeat from the people saying, "Oh, so real." Let's go. Man, we can change the world. We can. Got to do it for the boys and girls. The future. God has a sentence for your life. What's that? He sends you out to spread light. So we can change the world. Yes, we can change the world. We will. We can change the world. Yeah. We can change the world. That's right. We can change the world. We will. We can change the world. Yes, sir. We can change the world. Hey, we can change the world. Let's go.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Tell Me Your Story right here on Testimony House, where we tell a story inside of God's people out in the world. My name is John Simmons. In today's episode, we have another great testimony of Tom Kraeuter, who has gone over to Estonia to write a book called The Great Soviet Awakening. It's going to really open up our minds to seeing what the difference between a revival down the street is versus a revival, a God-sized revival. So we're excited for him to share the story of that he wrote in this book. And so let's invite Tom onto the program now. Tom, how are you doing?
I'm doing well today, John.
Yeah, let's talk about it. So we got the book here, and we'll put the link in the description for anybody here, The Great Soviet Awakening. So you find yourself in Finland, and then you got to get over to, and you hear this incredible story over. I'm just curious how you even end up there in the first place, because most of us, you're here in St. Louis. How do you end on the other side of the world? How do you end up over there?
Well, I was teaching. I've been privileged over the last, close to 30 years now, to teach in close to 500 different churches in almost every state in the U.S. and several other countries. God used a donkey in the Bible. I just feel like that's my the proof text of what I can do. And so I was teaching at this conference. I had been invited to go and speak. It was about unity, which is a big part of me and who I am. And so they asked me to come and teach. And that was great. I was excited about doing that. I wanted to do that. Some friends of mine were also teaching, and so I was a part of that. But again, this whole thing in Estonia was one of those I'm convinced God ordained coincidences. I mean, I could have not predicted what was going to happen there, and I expected to not be there. Right. And it wasn't, and it was interesting because as we're talking, this guy is sharing after the third service. He's almost 80 years old and kind of frail looking guy and telling us this incredible story. And I kept interrupting him and asking him questions. And I'm sure the others there are going like Tom, shut up, just let him talk.
Right.
but I realized later I'm on the plane on the way home late that afternoon, and I'm going, I have to write this story. I have to write this story. And so it took almost 2 years for me to convince him that I wanted to come and interview and do that. And I found out probably over a year and a half into it, the reason was because from his perspective, Americans like sensationalism, and they wanted the whole story told, not just the pretty parts. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, that's what I want. I'm all in on this. So once he realized that, they like rolled out the red carpet. They had an associate pastor pick us up from the ferry. My wife and daughter were with me, and take us around. This guy translates in 5 languages. Wow. I feel like most days I barely speak English, and he translates in 5 languages. And so he had all of the people that they could find come together in different places and different times and just sit and talk. And we videoed, recorded the conversation so that I could remember later on. But just so many amazing stories.
It's a good story, Tom, that you're sharing with us today because, here in the States, we think about revival. You might have a church down the street has a revival service. So, we've heard about Azusa Street. We've heard some of these stories over the years, but nothing happened recently into this kind of impact. So let's unpack some of the stories that you
Sure.
share in this book.
Sure. So one thing was that it started out kind of small in the early 70s as a local evangelistic thing, but even that was amazing that they could even do that under the communists. But it started to grow. And all of a sudden, people just started coming from all across the Soviet Union. And I'm talking about 1,000 miles or 1,000 kilometers away in near the Black Sea, 3,000 kilometers away in over on the far east side of Russia, Kamchatka. I only know where that's at from playing Risk, the board game. But so all of these people just started showing up, and some
Yeah.
of them, had heard from friends, something happened, maybe their neighbor got healed or something. Um, but others, they're asking them, and they said they had dreams and visions. And I'm a pretty conservative guy. I don't have that kind of stuff happen on a regular basis or anything.
Hmm.
But they had these dreams, these visions, and God said, "Go to Tallinn." One lady, that they were talking to said she didn't even know where that was. She thought it was in Italy, maybe. Go to Tallinn. Go to the church with the big steeple. You have to understand Ola Vista, this ancient cathedral, 1100 that was built. For a while, it was the tallest building in the world. It has a 400-foot steeple.
Oh my.
So go to Tallinn, go to the church with the big steeple. Well, even today, if you take a train to Tallinn, Estonia, you get out the first station, walk out the front door, and right in front of you is this church with this gigantic steeple. Can't miss it. So people just start coming, totally out of the blue. This is, again, this is late 70s under communist Russia. This is before the internet. There is no email. They can't even print flyers to have, invite people to come.
Hmm.
But they're having 3 times a month. I think it's the second and fourth Saturday and the second Sunday evening. They have these evening services, and this place, it's a big sanctuary, and it was packed. They told me that every seat was filled, and there was standing room only. And they estimated that there were 1,500 plus people. Now it was interesting because everybody that I talked to there seemed to be very conservative in not wanting to overstate what happened. But I do know for sure that Billy Graham was at this church some years later, and the communists would not let him do an altar call, which was part of his ministry. But they let these guys do it during this time, which is crazy. But the official record said that there were 4,000 people there for Billy Graham. So these people telling me that there's 1,500 at least, I'm guessing there's a lot more than that, but nobody wants
Hmm.
to inflate that number. It's just packed, and all of these people just kind of came in from all over the place. There were people sleeping on the floor in the train station. This is late 70s communist Soviet Union. They don't have, they're not well to do like most Americans. All right, they don't have
Hmm.
lots of stuff, so they're bringing their food with them in a basket, and they're sleeping on the floor in the train station just so they can be a part of what God is doing in this incredible thing. um, it was the whole thing from start to finish was absolutely mind-boggling. So think about this. It was 1950s, and the church then was vacant, nothing, collapsing basically in a lot of ways, nothing going on, and a Pentecostal prayer meeting. An older woman has a prophetic word, and she says that there's going to come revival out of Ola Vista Church, and it's going to come through the young people. And it's going to go on, and then the firemen are going to come and put the revival out. Now, I'm sure that there were people who were there who were going, are you crazy? I mean, this church is empty. There's been nobody in it for probably 100 years. There's no possible way. And yet God did it, and it was primarily young people, the way that it started. Um, and here's the crazy thing. So 1980s, I told you there were people sleeping on the floor in the train station. The the Olympics were held in the Soviet Union, the Summer Olympics. Now, most of us here don't remember that because we, the U.S., boycotted the 1980 Olympics.
Mm-hmm.
So we wouldn't remember. But all of the events were held in Moscow, except they didn't have a body of water in Moscow to hold the yachting races. So the yacht races were held in Estonia, in Tallinn. And so there are people from around the world who are going there. And, to help set up, to do all the things, and then during the Olympics themselves. And these people are asking a lot of questions, like, why are there people sleeping on the floor in the train station? Why? I mean, so many people. Why are there no flights available on certain weekends? Because everybody was flying in, all the seats were taken. And so it was at that point that the Soviet government finally stepped in and said, you can't do translation. So think about this, John. They were doing, back in 1980, they were doing translation with earphones in this ancient cathedral so that people could follow along with what was going on. So it wasn't just in Estonian. They made them stop doing the translations because all of these people were going, wait, what's going on here? And the eyes of the world were on this.
Yeah.
And they couldn't let it go on. So the firemen came in and put out the fire from 30 years before what this lady had said.
Wow.
Here's the deal. So when I go back 2 years later to interview the people, the guy that had told the story, he's now over 80 years old. I don't know that I've ever met anybody who had as much fire as this guy. I mean, he was so excited about God, his relationship with God, and you could see it in his eyes. Part of that prophetic word from back in the 1950s was that the firemen are going to put the fire out, but later the fire is going to come again. And he is, like, 40 years later now, still anticipating that God is going to move there in a powerful and profound way, like, or better than what he did back then. I mean, he's just all over it. It's going to happen. I mean, there's no question in his mind it's going to happen. So it's just
Tom,
yeah.
Let's talk about for a second the idea that the communist government is doing all this. They're being forced to sort of create a one denomination church there,
Mm-hmm.
and they're trying to squash Christianity there, but it's having sort of a different opposite impact that, I don't want our viewers to sort of miss that. So talk us through that and what was happening to individuals that were sort of, increasing their faith and seeing all these events of revival take place.
Yeah, and part of the reason, just so you understand, part of the reason that there was at least some level of freedom there is because Tallinn was the most Western in geography city in the Soviet Union, a major city, and it had some connection with Finland. It's a 2-hour ferry ride from Helsinki to Tallinn. And so the West wanted to, or the Soviets wanted the West to see this idea that they're not squelching Christianity. They're allowing them some freedom in what they're doing, and so they kind of loosened their grip. But as things happened, they realized they couldn't totally loosen. They had to tighten it up. So amazing stories of people that were born again there, people that were healed. One lady that I interviewed, I'm trying to think of how old she was when I interviewed her, probably 70 or so, young, obviously, in her 30s when she first was born again in that church. And she had never owned a Bible. She didn't know anything. So all she knew, her whole Christian experience, her whole Christian understanding was what she saw happening in that church during these services. And so she starts reading the Bible, reading the Gospels, and she sees exactly what's going on there. These simple messages from Jesus, which is what happened at the church. They would do a simple message during the service, a very strong gospel presentation, and then offer people the opportunity to respond to the gospel, and then also offer the opportunity for people to be prayed for healing. So she saw these simple messages in the Bible. She saw blind people seeing. She saw lame people walking. She saw the same things that she was seeing there in that church. It wasn't until sometime later that somebody told her that's not what normally happens in most churches. She just thought that was the way it was supposed to be because that's all she had seen. That's what she read. Must be. But that's not the norm, unfortunately. And I think maybe it should be a little bit more. They couldn't keep any records of specifics of what happened there, because if those things were found, somebody's going to be in trouble. So there were some stories that people remembered, and those are great. But one guy snuck a small cassette recorder in. And you and I would think, okay, that's kind of lame, but that's what the time frame was, and so he's got this cassette recorder and he records the services and then goes home and transcribes the miracles that happened. And so they ended up with, I'm trying to think, I think it was like 6 or 7 months worth of things that happened, of specifics that I got to get those things, and then obviously had to have them translated. But this very specific things that God did in healing people that couldn't see. The altar at this church, I have a picture of crutches, wheelchairs, eyeglasses. I mean, just all kinds of things that people left behind because they were healed. And one of the things that I found interesting was that they didn't allow somebody who was healed to give a testimony right then and there. They had to wait until the next service before they would allow it, because they wanted to make sure that this really was God. None of the people that kind of stewarded this, led this revival, were from a Pentecostal background. And they're seeing stuff happening they've never thought possible, they've never thought about before. But it was God's work in that place. I remember interviewing one Pentecostal preacher, and he was sure going into it that this couldn't be from God, because as a Pentecostal, he knew how to pray for people. If he's going to pray publicly, it's going to be a public prayer, and everybody's going to hear it. And they're up there praying, like, from his perspective, like these wimpy prayers that just kind of quiet and gentle. And people are getting healed. And he's going, I don't get how this works, but it did. God worked in spite of, any of their backgrounds or anything, in miraculous ways.
Yeah. The Great Soviet Awakening is the name of the book. We're going to link it in the description for anybody who wants to pick it up. Also, before we leave here today, Tom, tell us what sort of your big takeaway was in terms of what God did in your heart in the process of writing this book to sort of open your eyes to the things of revival.
Yeah. Probably the biggest one, and there's so many, but probably the biggest one for me was recognizing here are all these different types of churches all thrust together. People from lots of different backgrounds, all having to work together. And God, and that was one of the guy that was telling the story, that was a big thing for him. He said that if it hadn't been all of those churches coming together, this whole thing wouldn't have happened. And so I'm looking at that going, all right, we don't have today in our country an enemy like communism that's forcing us together. But I don't know. I think the handwriting's on the wall in a lot of ways, that could potentially happen. Mm-hmm. And even if it doesn't, what's the potential of the church in America? What could happen if we dropped our so often insignificant differences and actually decided to work together, to walk together in unity the way Jesus prayed for us? What I think there'd be no stopping us. I really do. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, that was the biggest takeaway. I was just struck by how God worked through all of these people, all these different backgrounds, and them deciding it's okay, we're going to work together.
Yeah, we see those stories in the Bible, and then, surprise, we see them in our own lives as well. What an encouraging testimony you shared with us today, Tom. Thanks so much for sharing the story of this Great Soviet Awakening with us today.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for letting me be with you, John.
Thanks for watching today's testimony with Tom Kraeuter, author of The Great Soviet Awakening. If you want to look in the link in the description, you'll be able to pick up the book that has all the testimonies of all the great things that God did in the revival of Estonia so many years ago. And as his friend said, he's believing for even more for God to do today. And so we can believe for this in our own hands, in our own lands, in our own cities, in our own towns, and we can believe for God to do great things, and we're just going to believe for that, and these stories can help encourage our faith in those areas. If you have a story that's worth encouraging someone with, email us, info@testimonyhouse.org. Maybe you can be the next person to share your story of what God has done in your life, or through your life, or maybe in your town with us here on the program. We want to say thank you for watching today's video. Until next time, guys, we pray you discover a future and a hope for your life today.
We ain't trying to blend in. If you're ready, come on with us, my friends. Come on, we can change the world. Hey, we can change the world. Let's go.
What changes the world? The only thing that ever really changes the world is when somebody gets the idea that love can abound and can be shared.